The last day of our International Cultural Literacy Festival. My name is Dr. Devonna Mallory. I am an English professor here. I am also the Director of Strengthening Foreign Language and International Programs that is putting on this festival. Now, today we have Natalie Daise, Creative Catalyst, and for more than 20 years, Natalie Daise has developed and facilitated interactive learning experiences for educators, students, and audiences in schools, universities, conferences, and other venues, both nationally and regionally. Well known to television audiences via Nick Jr. and Noggins TV's Gullah Gullah Island, her accomplishments include 1997 and 1998 Image Award nominations, 1998 Daytime Emmy nomination, the Silver and Gold Parents' Choice Awards, South Carolina's highest honor, the Order of the Palmetto, and the South Carolina's Jean Lacey Harris Folk Heritage Award, given for lifetime achievement and excellence in folk art. So please give a round of applause for Natalie Daise.
Hi there, we're an intimate group today. I know we set up for the stage, but it feels awkward to climb up on the stage to chat. So, are you good back there? Okay. Well, I'm a storyteller. That's about as old school a profession as one can have, but in some ways we are all storytellers. Everybody is busy telling their story any kind of way they can. They are tweeting it, they are periscoping it, they are posting it on Facebook, on Instagram. We are saying, here I am, will you get to know me? We want to be known. And not only do we want to be known, we're looking for our tribe. We're looking for somebody else who will say, with that like button, say, yeah, I'm like you. Yeah, you're not alone. We want those like buttons. And it doesn't really matter how old you are, because I'll do a post and I'll check, did anybody like it? And I laugh at myself. I say, okay, there I am looking for my tribe online. And sometimes I find them. Sometimes I find my tribe online, because we all are just looking for the people who will say, me too. That's what we want. And that's what stories do. That's what telling stories does. It helps us find the me too. Now sometimes we make assumptions, and you guys have to excuse me here because it's just us, so I'm going to be very comfortable. Sometimes we make assumptions, and we think that what we see is the most important me too. I mean, I do that. I was telling, and I was trying to get Doc, yeah. I was telling Devonna that yesterday I was seated in the hotel lobby eating breakfast. And I live on the coast of South Carolina. And the coast of South Carolina along the Atlantic Ocean has been very well developed. There are resorts. There are plantations with locked gates and people who've built millions of dollar houses and golf courses. And they've built these places where my ancestors used to live and work, where my ancestors actually created all the wealth that provided the land that they're now building on and putting up the gates. And after a while, on Pawleys Island, where I was living for about 4 years, you would never see a brown person unless you peeked into the kitchen at the restaurant. You just didn't. So even in the condo complex in which my husband and I, and for a while my children were living, there was us. And there's a certain way one presents oneself in that situation, even if you're doing it unconsciously. And yesterday, as I sat in the lobby, I've never been to Albany, Georgia. I looked at the people who came in and out of the lobby. I looked at the people who were having breakfast in the lobby. I looked at the folk who were walking and driving by, and I said, oh, there's brown people all over the place here. That's one thing that I can take off my psychological plate about who's like me. And I can put down, because that's a given. So I made my decision about who was like me because most of the people I saw were brown, and so they were like me. And I see this, we do this a lot, and there's a good reason for it. There's a good reason for it. You see it in you go into any middle school cafeteria and you look around. There's the brown kids, there's the Hispanic kids, there are the white kids. These are the people we'd say who are like me. What's really interesting is that that doesn't peter out when you become an adult. Several years ago, I was invited to go to San Antonio, Texas to do a workshop on diversity and inclusion. And I looked out at my room full of people. I had about 150 people. They were the Hispanic teachers. These were all educators. There was a group of nuns in full habit. They were sitting over there. There were sort of the white women in the Ann Taylor suits. There were educators who had been doing it for a while and were jaded, and you could tell, got me here at this conference. There were the new ones who were like all excited because, you know, they were going to be teaching children. And I thought, oh my goodness, this looks like a middle school cafeteria. So I decided to play a game. I had a big other plan that I wasn't going to work in that space because they were packed in too tight. So I started with just a simple question. I said, oh, you know, I haven't spent a lot of time in San Antonio. You know, what's the best kind of food to eat here? You know, so who thinks it was the pizza? Okay, well, who thinks it was the, okay. At each time that happened, I would say, well, look at the people who are like you. How many of you have been teachers forever? How many of you ever knew? But then we began to break it down even smaller. Who had a pet? How many of your pets were dogs? How many of you had, and after a while, something began to happen in this room where everybody was broken up into the groups that they thought were like them. The girl with the pink hair and the nose ring, and the woman with the $300 haircut and the $500 suit had both grown up with horses. And they had had this shared experience of what it was like to have, and they began to talk about it. And this one woman said, this is going on for a while, and I'm really enjoying this. And then a woman, she had been very quiet. She was sitting somewhere near the back, and she said, can I tell you a story? I said, yeah. She said, I had a dog. I have a dog. I love my dog. I said, okay. And she said, she was taking her dog to the vet. It's a little cutesy, armsy dog, you know. And as she was going to the car, another dog in the neighborhood that was running loose ran up and grabbed her dog. And she was struggling to get her dog back from this bully dog. And the dog hurt her dog. And she was in tears. She was crying about how she almost lost her dog. And she said, where I grew up, the idea of a dog as a pet was not even realistic. Where I grew up, you would eat a dog. And then another woman, dressed in a nun's habit, seated in this side of the room, said, me too. I'm from the Philippines. Where are you from? And she said, I'm from the Philippines. And they'd grown up near each other. And I thought, that's what happens when we tell our stories. We become real. We move beyond what we assume makes someone like us to find out what really does. So as a storyteller, I think I do something very important. Now sometimes I'm on social media, you know, but I also like to do this thing where we tell stories. Now what I'm going to do today, there's just a few of us, so I'm going to share some stories with you. I'm going to share the evolution of my own storytelling experience, and maybe somewhere in here you'll hear me too. I do believe that I was born a storyteller, though, you know, as a child, it was basically the thing that got me a beating, because I used storytelling as a child as a survival mechanism. Who broke that? I don't know. I mean, I think somebody came in the house while we were, you know, that's how I told stories as a child, and it was not appreciated. But what I was also doing was, as a child, was listening. Now, I don't know what it's like in terms of your homes or my house, but in my house there were several generations kind of in and out of there. There was my mother and my great-grandmother lived in the house with us, and my daddy. Now, I have a tendency to talk about the women, so much so that people think there were no men. I will clear that up now. There were, and I was very close to them. But in my storytelling evolution, it's about the women. And I only say that too because you know how I say people bring people see you and they figure there's a story. I went to a therapist many years ago and I was talking about my mother, and this was a therapist who had probably read books about Black American families. And she said to me, "So tell me what it was like growing up with no men in your home." I said, "Did I say that? I didn't say that. Why would you assume I grew up with no men in my home? There were men all over the place. There was my daddy, there was grandfathers, there were uncles. I'm just talking about the women right now, okay?" So she looked at me, and she had some stories already to the back of her head to attach to my appearance, and she told herself those stories. So then I had to tell her a different story. But I'm telling you now, I'm talking about the women, but the men are important. Now in my house, my great-grandmother basically ran the house. And there was my mother, and then occasionally there was her mother or my mother-in-law. And they generally did, fairly traditionally in the 60s and 70s, they did most of the stuff that happened in the kitchen at that time. And they also, my mama did my hair. She would burn the crap out of me with that hot iron from the top. Wow, scary experiences. So also, when she's doing your hair, please sit still, with my mama's hand shook. But I would sit there quietly, and I would listen to them talk. And they were always telling stories. Now, sometimes it sounded like gossip, but it really is just a story. I heard Sister so-and-so got a bun in the oven. And I learned early on not to say, "Oh, she was cooking," because then they would realize and they would get rid of me. They would send me out the room. So what I learned was sit quietly and listen to them tell stories. Don't say anything. Don't bring attention to yourself. And I think I developed a storyteller's voice listening to them, not gossip, tell stories about who had a bun in the oven or making foot for sock or whatever. But I was very shy. And I know you hear people who perform always talk about, "I was so shy." It was true. It was true. Painfully shy. However, I also grew up in a church. And in the church, there were expectations that you would learn certain pieces. That's what they call them, your piece. And then at the appropriate time at church, you would stand up and recite it. You were expected to do so. And my mother had a thing about me being able to elocute properly. I was very shy, but if I had to learn a part, my mother had me learn the part. I learned dynamics. Do it louder, do it softer, emphasize this. And so my very, very first thing I remember, I was in first grade, and there was a school play about, and the church ran a little school, about health, and my role was the bag of sugar. I was the enemy. And I remember very clearly my line. "I'm public enemy number 1. I'm out to get you, everyone." And then I bowed. And all the church ladies. And then they pulled me aside and said, "It is not get, it is get." Because there was a certain kind of educated black woman that I grew up around. And these women, and I don't know if you might not have known these women. These were the educated black women who articulated so very well that they missed no consonants, even if the consonant was silent. They hit it. I grew up around these folk. They were at my church. And they wanted us to be able to do that. So I grew up with that, but I never thought I'd be a storyteller. The storytelling didn't even begin to manifest until I was 22 and sort of running away from home. Lived up in upstate New York, had an encounter with a person who was not a good person, who hurt me, and went through the legal system, which was awful. And after it, could not bear to be there anymore. And so I had a relative in my extended family, because everybody I knew in the North had people in the South. Nobody I knew in the North wasn't from the South. So I had a grandmama, uncle, aunties in the South, and it was decided that they bought me a one-way bus ticket, which seemed to be a message like, don't come back. And they sent me to South Carolina. Help out with my grandmother, who was sick. And she was sick, and I was a help, but I really thought at the time, oh, they just threw me away. Caught the Greyhound bus, 24 hours, to South Carolina's coast. Got out and thought I had walked into a Sounder movie or something. I'm like, they have got me back here in the woods. It was on an island. You crossed a few bridges. There were trees. It was dark. There were acres and acres of dark. There were probably things in the trees that might eat me. My aunt had picked me up at the bus station and took me to this little trailer where my grandma was living. And I went in the trailer, and it wasn't even like full bedrooms. There was like little berths, and the bed like was built in, like on a cot on a shelf, you know. And I sat in that little room that night, and then I looked and I saw this giant bug. And honestly, I am not lying, it was this long. I'm not exaggerating. And it was walking along the ceiling. And you know how when you see something and you think, I wonder what that could be? Because you haven't encountered it. So I was very still, and I'm watching this giant bug, and then it opened its wings and it flew. And I said, oh my God, if I could get back to the bus station, But it was dark and I was in the woods and I could not. And I stayed up the rest of the night because I didn't know what else was going to come crawling out of that trailer. But there I was, and I met my Uncle Simeon. I'd met him before, but this was the first time I had anything to do with him. Now, my Uncle Simeon was a Gullah Geechee man, born and raised on St. Helena Island. He spoke Gullah sometimes, he spoke English sometimes, but he was also a naturopath, and that was the part that was most interesting about him. He knew what was growing out there. If you were sick, people called my uncle. Now, he was a nurse, he was a certified nurse, but he didn't believe in any of that. So there were people who would go see the doctor, then they would call my Uncle Simeon, and my Uncle Simeon would show up with his big van, and there would be herbs and plants and bark and a colonic board and a juicer. And there were folk with cancer, and there were folk with other illnesses, and they called my Uncle Simeon. And so he started bringing me along with him. I would travel along with him. He'd go in, and he'd make up tea and poultice and whatever, and treat folk all around the island, because a lot of folks still believe more in traditional medicine than in Western medicine, because they figured those doctors were trying to kill him. And he had some successes. But he would drive around with me, and he would tell me stories about the people he encountered, like Cornbread. Cornbread was his friend. Cornbread had I don't know why Cornbread had so many pieces of cars in his yard. But if you needed anything fixed, you could go get Cornbread, because Cornbread had it in his yard. And I don't even know Cornbread's name other than Cornbread. That's all I know. Till the day he died, it was Cornbread. So Simeon would go, he'd take me to Cornbread's, and he'd take me to see his folk, and he would tell me stories, and I would listen. And a few months into it, I met my husband. I didn't know he was going to be my husband. He was this guy who was teaching English at the technical college, and my cousin said, you should hear this guy sing. I'm bringing him to church. He's going to sing. He went to church and he sang, and when he sang, he caught my attention. And he came to the house afterwards, and he thought I was weird because my uncle had told me to be on a carrot juice fast, so I was on a carrot juice fast, and I was orange. And so, but he didn't think I was so weird. And we began to sing together, and eventually I married him. And the first Christmas I was with him, he took me to his family's home on St. Helena Island. There were 9 children. He was the baby. Lived in a little house way back in a community called Cedar Grove. On these islands, people know the communities by their old plantation names, even though there's no sign anywhere that tells you that's what it is, but they still know. As a matter of fact, this is so very ingrained in that a person from one community and plantation will think that the person from another one is a foreigner. They're like, well, I'm from Croft. And I think, well, Croft is 3 miles down the road. Well, that's a whole other community. Those people from there, they're kind of funny. Well, it's just very, very much like that. So he took me out there, and all of the siblings were home, and I was there as my shy little self, and I met the strangest group of Gullah people I'd ever met in my life. They were doctors and scientists and philosophers. They lived all over the country, but they would come home, eat shrimp and rice and shrimp and grits, and get drunk and tell stories. And I listened. And the first story that stuck with me that I now tell all the time was a story that I first heard at my husband's house that first Christmas. You see, they were sitting around the table laughing. You know how folk do holidays, you get together and you start telling stories. You're telling folk tales. They are folk tales. They're just the tales folk tell. And you say stuff like, remember when so-and-so did so-and-so? You know, and every time you get together, you remember that same story. You do it when you've been in school together, and maybe you've gone off for the break, and you come back and you go, girl, remember when so-and-so did? It's a folk tale. Well, they were telling the folk tale because one sister said, remember when Peachy burned down the house? And they said, ha, 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 ha. I thought, that would sound funny. So I started asking questions. And this is the story that I learned. Peachy was a hard-working woman. When it was tomato season, she picked tomatoes. If it was shrimp season, she was down on the dock heading shrimp. If it was crab season, she picked crab until her hands were tough and scarred. And her feet were too. She could barely fit them in the men's boots that she wore. Now, Peachy lived in a community known as Coffin Point, back on the island. And she lived in a little house with her two almost grown children, Pot of Gold and Iwana. Now, Pot of Gold and Iwana were big enough and old enough to work too, but they didn't like to work much. Whenever Peachy would say to her son, Pot, why don't you come down to the dock with me today? Pot would say, okay, Ma. Oh, remember how I hurt my back? Ma, I don't think I could go. When she'd say to her daughter, Wana, won't you come to the fields with me today? Wana would say, well, I don't think so. So Peachy would go on. And she'd work all day and then come back to the house to take care of those most grown children. Now, one day, Peachy was out in the tomato fields. It was tomato season. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever picked tomatoes. If you have not, let me tell you that this is a challenging job. When I first went to South Carolina, and I needed some income, and I looked for work, and I couldn't find anything, and my cousin said, well, we're going to the tomato fields. So why don't you come and work in the tomato fields with us, because you can make some money. And I said, okay. So I took my little New York raised self to the tomato field. And I had my bag, and I went out there. And there were a lot of people working in the fields, and you could tell there had been people who had been working the tomato fields for a long time. And you see, you pick the tomatoes when they are hard and green. The tomatoes are green. The plants are green. The snakes and the bugs are green. And you reach in and you snap off that tomato. There's a little audible snap because they're green. And you put it in your bag, and you get another one, and you put it in your bag. And you can tell the people who have been doing it for a long time because you don't stand all the way up to slow you down. You move like this, and you pick these tomatoes. And when you fill your bag, you put it down, and you get another one because you get paid by weight, not by time. This did not work well for me. I was out in that tomato field for close to 9 hours. I made $8.60 because I didn't pick enough weight. But there's another thing that happens. As you are picking these green tomatoes, and there's this sap, this white sap that comes out the end where you snap it off, and that sap begins to coat your skin. And it begins to harden and turn brown, and it hardens like shellac. We'll get these little cracks in it, and it'll start to itch. And the only way to get it off, I learned this by watching those who were pros, was to get another green tomato and crush it, and then use it to scrub it off. And the acid in that green tomato will dissolve that sap. And that is what Peachy had been doing all day, from day clean or morning till the sun be red for down or evening. And at the end of the day, she was tired and sticky and muddy. And she took herself home to the little house in Coffin Point and her two big old, most grown children. And when she walked in the house, there they were, sitting at the kitchen table, playing Tom. Oh, Mama, I'm so glad you're home. I'm hungry. What you gonna cook? Oh, Mama, that Montgomery Ward catalog came, and I saw a sweater in there. I want me that sweater, Mama. Can you get me that sweater? And Peachy looked at those children. And she said, just wait a minute. And she went on over to the old wood-burning stove because she still had one of those, and it was cold. And she looked in the wood box, and it was empty. So she said, look, I'll cook if somebody just go get some wood. And Pot of Gold said, okay, oh, Ma, I would chop some wood. Oh, there go my back again. And Iwana said, you want me to go and get some wood? Look like it's getting dark out there, ain't it? It's getting dark out there. Something could get me out there. I ain't going out there. And Peachy looked at those children. And she looked at that stove. She looked back at the children. Then she did something she'd never done before. She went on over to an old straight back chair. And she sat it down by that cold stove, and she sat in it. And she decided she was not going to move until she got warm, and she didn't care how it happened. So she just sat there in that old straight back chair and began to rock herself back and forth. She began to rock and hum. Now her children had never seen her do anything like that before. They say, "Mama, you all right? Mama, you okay?" Peachy didn't say a word. Just sat there rocking and humming. Now Pot of Gold and Wanda did not know what to do, and after a while, Pot said, "Wanda, come on, come out here." And they went out the house and they stood on the porch. Pot said, "You think Mama finally gone cracky?" Wanda said, I don't know. You gonna go get some wood?" And they looked on over to the trees, and it was getting full dark now. And Pot said, "I ain't going out there." He said, "You gonna get some wood?" She said, "I ain't going out there. What we gonna do?" And then Wanda just happened to look down, and they had always meant to hammer down that loose top step. And she said, "We can burn this." So she reached down and she pulled up the loose step, and they went in the house and they took it in the stove and they started a fire. And after a while, the stove started to get warm, and Peachy reached her tired hands out toward it. And when it got good and hot, she got up. She put on a pan of cornbread. She fried some fish. She put on a pot of rice. Everything was just like it should be. And they had a great meal, and the children were happy, and everything was going along fine until the fire began to die down. And as the fire began to die down, so did Peachy, until by the time it was out, she was back, sitting in her old straight back chair, rocking and humming. Now this went on for some time with Peachy rocking and humming and rocking until Pot of Gold or Awana got cold enough or hungry enough or scared enough of all the above to go get another piece of wood. And soon the steps were gone. And then the porch. And they started on the house. A piece of the windowsill, a piece of the door frame, a piece of the floor, a piece of the wall, until one day, if you just happened along, you would see Peachy, Pot of Gold, and Awana sitting in the empty field with the potbelly stove. Now, this will seem strange to you if you just happened on it, but Peachy and her children had been burning down their own house bit by bit and piece by piece for so many years, nobody had even noticed. End of story. Thank you. Now, I've told that story on and off for some years, based on truth, but I am a storyteller. So there's been some variation. And so I told that story one year, and someone said, "What's the moral to that story?" And I said, "Well, it doesn't seem to have one. You don't think there's one?" She said, "No, you got to come up with one." So I came up with this one. You might think it's peachy to wait on a pot of gold if you want to, but you'll end up out in the cold. Moral. Now, what's true about that story? What's true is that there was an aunt named Peachy. That's what we called her. That's what she was called. That's what they called her. Probably a basket name on the coast of South Carolina and probably in other places too. Folk were sometimes had other names. The nicknames and things people call people so often that folk forget the names that they were given on their birth certificate. Hers was Peachy. I don't think her mama named her Peachy, but that's what folk called her. Pot of Gold is the only name I know for him. Now, Pot of Gold wasn't her son. I gave her son that name, but Pot of Gold was also a family member. He died a couple of years, last year. He died last year. Pot of Gold is all I know. I don't know what his mama called him. I just got to figure, I got an idea of what she hoped for him by giving him that name. And Awana was also a family member, though she wasn't Peachy's daughter. But I gave her children those names because they seemed appropriate. So what is true is that Peachy lived in a house on Coffin Point with her children. What is true is that they burned their house for fuel. That is true. And I've always wondered why. Because I couldn't ask her. When I came along, Peachy was very ill and very old. And she was living in a double-wide trailer on Coffin Point. And what I know about that double-wide trailer is that Peachy had a sister. Her sister was a domestic worker. And her sister had gone north up to Maryland to work. She had followed a family up there and was taking care of them. And she was saving all her money. She was saving her money for a big funeral because a big funeral was a big deal. So she was saving her money. I don't know. Maybe she wanted a funeral train that went from Maryland back to St. Helena. But when she heard that Peachy and her children had pretty much burned themselves out, she sent them some money and bought them a double wide. And that is where Peachy died. But that's the first family story. That was the first folk tale that I heard sitting quietly in the kitchen listening to someone laughing about, remember when Peachy burned down their house? And it was sort of the beginning of me consciously collecting stories. Now, there are many others that I've learned, because folk tell me stories. I'm that person. My husband says that if I'm in a room and there's anybody crazy, he says crazy. I don't say crazy. I say particularly interesting. They will go boop, 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 and come and tell me a story, which is really kind of fine with me. I love it. I love it. Tell me a story, please, because people tell you the most wonderful things, and because they want you to see who they are. There was a man, he called himself Boise Lolly. That's all I know. But I used to go get my hair done in a little salon out on St. Helena Island, and Boise Lolly was like one of the community drunks. And he would come into the salon several times while I was here, you know, and they'd be Boise. I mean, but they treated Boise Lolly with respect. You know, they didn't, you know. He would come and hang around a little bit, you know, maybe he wanted to sweep up a little something, you gave him, and, you know, he'd go off. But Boise Lolly would sometimes talk about the fact that he had been a pilot. And people's like, they didn't believe him, but I thought, you know, maybe he had. Maybe Boise Lolly had been a pilot in one of those wars. Because he talked about what the world looked like from the sky. And I just imagined what it must have been like for this man to be up in the air and have that kind of freedom. Maybe it was World War II. There were some Tuskegee Airmen retired in our community. As a matter of fact, some of them trained in South Carolina. Maybe Boise Lolly had been one of them. But I would imagine what that might have been like, that freedom to fly and then to come back to earth, to rural South Carolina, where he couldn't walk into the store. That might make me drink. He wanted us to see him, so he would tell us these stories. And I don't know what Boise Lolly's given name was. But people want you to know their story. So the other night I checked into the hotel. And as I was pulling up, this man came and he knocked on my window. And I did my normal thing like. And then I was like, I'm not parking on the street. And I went and I parked in the driveway. And in the parking lot, when I came up, he was sitting in a bench by the hotel. And I looked at him and I caught his eye. Once you keep folks' eyes, you see him. And he said, well, you got a little something there. I said, yeah, I do. So I reached in and I found a couple of dollars. As I thought, it was cold, it was so cold, it was so cold. That's not going to do nothing. And when I gave him the money, he gave me something. He gave me his name. Because people want to be seen. He said, my name is Henry Lee. I said, hi, Henry. And he said, you know, I said, where are you from? And he said he was from someplace in southern Georgia. And he said, you know, but I got mental illness, and my people, you know, they can't deal with me. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that, Henry Lee. I'm sorry about that. I hope you find a place to stay warm tonight. And I used his name 3 times because he gave it to me. He said, see me? We only had a few seconds. But he wanted somebody to know something about him. He couldn't tell me his whole story, but he told me his name. And so all I could do, the best I could do, was give it back to him a few times. Okay, Henry Lee, He said, well, you pray for me here. I said, I sure will. And I thought, $2. But I could give him his name. I can say, I see you, and you told me a little piece of your story. Because that's all we want. That's all we want. So there's an old story. Now this story is actually a story that is a freedom tale. And it was first collected, and I love it. This is a story some of you may have heard. It's called The People Could Fly. And it was recorded on Johns Island, South Carolina, which is near Charleston, South Carolina, on the coast, on the Atlantic Ocean. This is where our ancestors who came to grow rice lived, our Gullah Geechee ancestors. And this story was collected back when the WPA was going out, when the government was funding folk to go out and collect stories. That's when this story was first recorded. Now, it's been written down several times, but it's the first professional story, I should say, that I learned to tell. This is a story that my husband said to me one day, you know, let's like tell stories. And there's more to that story, and I'll get to it. And that's the first one that I learned, and so it's near and dear to my heart. But we've always wanted it to be known. They say that the people could fly. They say that long ago, way back in Africa, all God's children had wings, and they could float on the air just like smoke rising from a chimney. But they say that when our ancestors were packed into those ships, they forgot all about that power. The ups and the downs and the death and the smells just wiped it from their minds. And when they got here, to this place that looked like home but not, and worked in these fields, it further drove it from their mind. Some of them forgot completely. Some of them, but some remember. One who did was an old man, and they called him Josh. And another was a dark, beautiful woman they called Sula. Now, Sula had come from a proud family, and she walked with a grace and a beauty that was as natural as her dark skin. Some folk thought she was uppity, thought she had an attitude. Overseer said, who do you think you are walking around like you're somebody? He gave her a hard time whenever he could. One day, Sula was working in the field with her child tied to her back, and the child began to cry. Right about then, old Overseer came riding by. Keep that baby quiet, he yelled. So Sula, she decided to stoop in the row and nurse her child, and she turned the child around from where he was tied to her back, and she scooted down to feed him. And the Overseer said, I didn't tell you to stop working. And as he rode by, he brought his whip down hard across Sula's back. And her back began to bleed. And she stumbled to her knees in the sandy soil. Now the old man, the one they called Josh, was nearby, and he came running to help her. I have got to leave here, she said. I've got to leave this place before I forget who I am. Then go, he said. And he began to speak to her words that were like winds from across a wide ocean, like breezes from a far distant land. And Sula she just stepped up on the air like it was some kind of invisible stair, and with her child held tight to her chest, she just flew away. Well, it was hot that day. It was so hot you could see the air dancing and wiggling in front of your face the way it does. And one young man, he could not take the heat, and he fell over. And then another. Old Overseer came running to get them back to work, but the one they called Josh was there first, with those words that were like winds from across a wide ocean, like breezes from a far distant land. And those two young men just rolled over on the air and whew, flew away like two big blackbirds. Conjure words, yelled the Overseer. I heard you using conjure words. And he went running up to Josh, but Josh was gone, just running across those fields, saying those wind words, those breeze words to those in the field who could fly, and those who could fly stopped work. And they stood up And they came together and they joined hands in a great big ring. Ring the bell of freedom. Ring the bell, so to say. Ring today, not tomorrow. Ring the bell. Ring the bell for my loving mother. Ring the bell, so to say. Ring today, not tomorrow. Ring the bell. Ring the bell, let's go to heaven. Ring the bell, so to say. Ring today, not tomorrow. Ring the bell. Ring the bell. The overseer came running to stop the singing, but they just rose up in the air like a great flock of big black birds up over the fields, over the plantations, and away, they say, to freedom. That's how the story goes. There are those, thank you. There are those who say, why would you tell that story? Because people can't fly. But the old people, who know many strange and wonderful things, have told me, and they say that the people could fly. And I believe them. That story is probably one of the most important stories to me, for lots of different reasons. And I tell it to people of all ages. Now, several years ago, I was actually up at Berry College, which is somewhere in northern Georgia. And they decided to take me, yesterday I went to an elementary school, so they decided to send me to an elementary school of really little people. And I didn't tell them that story, but I told them another freedom story. And then as I was talking to these 4- and 5-year-olds about freedom, I thought, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Let me try to explain what it's like to be enslaved. And so I was trying to come up with something, And so I said, well, just imagine that you have no power in your own life to make any decisions. That you can't decide what to eat or what to wear or when you're going to go somewhere. And then I realized they're 4. They can't decide now. They all think they're slaves now. This has not worked. So I began to think about that. How do you talk about something like this with very little people? And then I realized, 4-year-olds may not understand freedom, but they understand justice. They absolutely do. And so there's a story that I share, and I share it with my littlest people. But here's the thing about stories, is that stories have no age limit. Lots of times when you hear storyteller, people are somehow expecting me to do clown faces and a balloon. I don't know why. I will tell stories to little people, but to me, age is has nothing to do with story, because in all of us, there is a connection to story that never goes away. Even if we tweet it, we are connected to story. So this is the story that I began to tell. And it's a mouse story. There was a farmer and his wife. They lived on a little farm, and they had just enough of everything they needed. They grew just enough grain. They had a little house. They had a barn, and in their barn, they had a cow, a horse, a pig, and a chicken. And in their house, there was a mouse. Now, the mouse liked to live in the house because the farmer and his wife, well, sometimes when they ate, they would drop crumbs and things on the floor, and the mouse would run out and eat it and run away. And sometimes the farmer would hitch the horse up and go into town and come back with packages, and in those packages would be good things to eat. So the mouse was having a good time living in the house. And one day, the farmer had taken the horse to town, and the mouse was in the window waiting for the farmer and the horse to come back. And soon he saw them coming up the road, and the mouse was so excited. Ooh, I wonder what they had, I wonder what they had. And the farmer came up to the house, and he took out of the cart a brown package tied with string, and the mouse's excitement increased. And the farmer brought the package in, and he set it on the table, and he untied the string, and he opened it, and it was a mouse trap. And the mouse said, "Oh, the farmer wants me dead! Oh no, I've got to tell somebody, I got to tell somebody, what am I going to do? And so the mouse ran from the house, and he went to the barn, and he said, "The farmer has a mouse trap! The farmer has a mouse trap! Oh no, the farmer has a mouse trap!" And the chicken said, "Well there, mouse, sounds like you've got a problem. Too bad for you." And the chicken went up to the roost. The poor mouse, the mouse said, oh no, they have to understand, the farmer has a mousetrap, the farmer has a mousetrap, the farmer has a mousetrap. And the pig came along. Mouse, so I hear there's a mousetrap. It was good knowing you. Oink, oink. And the pig went off to wallow in the dirt. And poor mouse. But the farmer has a mousetrap! And the cow said, "Ooh, mouse, I've always liked you. I'm sorry for you. Moo." And went off to munch hay. The mouse said, but the farmer has a mousetrap. And then, because the mouse did not know what else to do, the mouse went back to the house, and it crawled in this little mouse hole, and it huddled there, worried because the farmer wanted him dead. And late in the night, in the dark of the night, suddenly a sound was heard. Snap! Now the farmer's wife heard that noise, and she thought, I guess we finally gotten that pesky mouse. And she hopped out of bed. She didn't even bother to light a lantern or turn on a light or even put on shoes. She padded into the kitchen to see if they had gotten that mouse. And in the dark, she put her foot down on a snake that had been slithering across the kitchen floor and had gotten its tail caught in the trap. And the snake was scared because a big bare human foot had just come down on top of it. And so the snake did what snakes do when they are scared. It bit her. And she screamed, "Ah!" Now the farmer heard this, and he hopped up and he ran in, and there was his wife, and she was bleeding, and she was screaming, and there was a snake, and so he killed the snake, and he got rid of the snake, and he took his wife, and he put her to bed, and he packed ice on her foot, and he did everything he knew how to do, but the wife began to get ill because it had been a poison snake. And she got sicker, and he didn't know what to do, and so he asked neighbors for help, and one of the neighbors said, "You know, when my wife was sick, I got her some chicken soup." And so the farmer got his axe. And he went out to the barn, and he said, "Chop!" And he made some chicken soup. But his wife, well, she didn't get any better. As a matter of fact, she got sicker, and soon it became known that she was probably going to die. And so the neighbors came, and you know how folk do, to sit with the farmer and to sit and keep watch. And the farmer had so many people there, and he didn't know how he was going to feed them all, and so he got his axe and he went to the barn and chop! Barbecued ribs and pork for the neighbors. And finally, well, the wife, she didn't pull through. And the farmer was so sad that he just couldn't keep up with the crops, and things began to fall behind. And he didn't know how he was going to pay the bill, so he went to the barn and he got the cow and he sold it. And the little mouse had been watching all of this from its little place, this little hidey hole. And he said, I tried to tell him. The farmer had a mousetrap. Didn't they know? A mousetrap for me is a mousetrap for everybody. End of story. And it's interesting because I tell that story to children, and I used to think, well, maybe I need to explain. No, I don't. I was telling that story to a group of kids at a church in Charleston. One little boy, he was about 5. You know those kids who are like so extremely articulate that you think, how old are you? I know you look like you're 5, but I think you're 30. He said, and I said, yes. He said, so what I understand is that because nobody helped the mouse with his problem, there was no one to help them with their problem. And I said, you got it. Lots of stuff you can do with a story. And so now I never tell stories to children without telling that story. Because I think it's important. Stories are powerful, powerful things. That's why we are tweeting and Instagramming and Snapchatting and periscoping, because we want to know the story. But they are powerful things. Think about the fact that when you do that, even though we send that stuff out there, and sometimes we don't think about it, we're just looking for the likes. We are sending real things out into the world that make a difference. Positive or negative, they're making a difference. They're changing something. They're informing how we are seen. They're informing how we think about something. They're informing the story that someone is listening to, listening for, seeing, forming in their own mind. Now, sometimes it's really weird. I was speaking once at this church, and I have to check my time because, you guys, we've just been sitting here chatting. And I don't want to keep you here longer than you want to be. Oh, we're all okay. We got a few more minutes. So I was at this church, and I was speaking. Was I speaking? No, I wasn't speaking. I was in the audience. And it was a church where very few people looked like me. As a matter of fact, there were just 2 of us. I went to hear the speaker, and then afterwards, a gentleman who did not look like me came up to me. And he said, I really want to learn about black culture. And so because I'm trying to learn more about black culture, I've been watching BET. I was like, oh, shoot. I was at church. Give me a break. Yeah. He was watching BET. He was serious. And I said, oh, that's interesting. You might, maybe you might want to expand your research beyond BET. That's like me saying, I really am interested. I'm fascinated in white culture. So I turned on MTV so that I could understand who you are. People are looking for a story. There's all these stories out there. There are all these stories that we're constantly adding to the story. I'm not saying that BET doesn't add to the story. It adds to the story. It's just not the whole story. And so the more we share authentic stories, the more we share our authentic selves, the bigger and broader the story might be. Now, that might not work for most people. But even if it's just as simple as me and Henry Lee on the front of the hotel where he gave me his name and told me where he was from. So because he did not want to be the bum in front of the hotel who was begging. He wanted to be a man named Henry Lee because he wanted to be seen. Now, we are almost at the end. And so what I did today was really interesting because I have a plan. I've got a plan. But then what I absolutely know is my plan can go out the window depending on who's here and what feels right. And so today, it was just a small, intimate group here today. And so I changed that plan, and I let this happen. And I hope that's okay with you. If you got a few minutes and you want to ask me just about anything, I will answer almost anything. No questions of any kind?
Any comments?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for listening. You guys have a great rest of your day.